You're listening to the Kitchen Confession Podcast with Chef Mary Mamalidi. I think my favorite thing about this whole learning process of tasting whiskey has been the fact that I started out really skeptical of those tasting notes that you hear. They sound so ridiculous, and you're thinking, okay, if you're putting grain into a pot and distilling alcohol from it, how could you possibly be tasting vanilla or pineapple or whatever else the heck you're saying? But then the more reading that you do and the more learning that you do, you find out why these flavors are imparted. And it's very interesting to learn about the chemistry and the fact that these flavors do exist.
I'm Mary Mamalidi, and you're listening to the Kitchen Confession Podcast. Today, we're going to be chatting with, some of you may know him and have heard his smooth introduction at the beginning of each episode, Matt Agnew. He's the producer and editor of this show. Hey, Matt.
Hey, Mary. How's it going?
Good. How's it going?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Now, the reason why I have you on this show, and I'm so excited to talk to you, I'm looking forward to this because I know nothing about it. We're going to be talking about whiskey.
Yes. And thank you, by the way, for letting me out from the editing suite to join you on the show here.
Well, I'm sure everyone wants to hear from you.
Well, I'm really excited about this. This is one of my big hobbies. I really like whiskey and whiskey tasting, and I find the chemistry behind the whole thing fascinating. So I'm excited to share more of that with you.
I know zero about whiskey, so I want you to take me and the listeners, hopefully, all the way through from the beginning. So if you tell us a little bit about how you actually got interested into learning about whiskey, flavors, profiles, all that good stuff.
First of all, it's just a good drink. It just kind of started that, out with friends and decided to try a Scotch. In fact, I think it started even earlier than that because I always remember at my grandparents' house, my granddad had quite the whiskey board kind of on a side table in the dining room, and had lots of, really, really interesting looking bottles and things like that. And so it's a really diverse drink. There's lots to explore and lots to discover. I think it can be daunting for a lot of people because there's just so much to choose from. But I think that's kind of the cool thing about it. I've been drinking and tasting whiskey for years now, and still just kind of put a scratch on the surface of what there is out there. The other thing about whiskey is that it's accessible at almost any price bracket. Like you don't have to drop hundreds of dollars on a really fancy bottle of Scotch. It's interesting to explore the curve of diminishing results. You know what I mean? Like, can you taste the difference between a $40 bottle of Scotch versus a $150? Probably there's a pretty big jump there. But then if you jump from $150 to you could easily spend north of $1,000 on a bottle of, nice old Scotch.
Okay, but is something like that wasted on someone like me who knows absolutely nothing about it? Because you do sample, you taste, you know exactly what you're looking for. You can discern the difference between the two, correct?
Yeah, for sure. Now, let me say first, Mary, that I would never, ever recommend anybody to snub the opportunity at $1,000 bottle of whiskey. If you get that opportunity, you need to take it.
But how would I know that it's $1,000? Because I don't drink it. When we sit there, and even when I was talking to you about this, you talk about the different notes within the Scotch or within whiskey in general. And that's something how can I pick this out?
Why don't we start with the distilling process? And that helps to kind of understanding the chemistry behind what's happening will help to understand where these different flavors come from. So the distillation process starts with selecting your grain, and all whiskey is distilled from some kind of grain mash, and it can be a combination. Most traditional ones are barley, rye, and corn, and those kind of determine what type or style the whiskey will be. Some are blends, and some are only one kind of grain.
So you can blend the different grains.
Yes, yeah, you can blend them up. Canadian whiskey is a great example of blended grains. And a lot of that has to do with the history and access to the type of grain. So Canadian whiskey is coming mainly from the prairies, right? With
Right.
access to a lot of different types. But then you also have even some, craft brewing is becoming really, really popular, but so is craft distilling. And so more places are starting up, and they're experimenting with different things that we have access to now in our Canadian markets. Things like quinoa. So yeah, you're seeing some experimentation with some unconventional kinds of grains and the kind of products those are coming up with. But that's definitely the base of the distilling process, and it has a big impact on the flavor.
So it starts with a grain.
It starts with the grain, and then what kind of yeast. Alcohol is pretty flavorless, actually. It's
Mm-hmm.
all these extra byproducts from the microbial cultures and the yeast byproducts, those sorts of things that are adding a lot of flavor. But there's kind of different categories, and during the distilling process, it allows
Yeah.
sort of separate those out.
So it's the strain of yeast that makes different flavors pull from each batch.
That's right. During the distilling process, we're separating those out. So after one run through the pot still, say, you might have something that is kind of like a flavoring whiskey. So it's still got a lot of those esters and congeners, those byproducts of the yeast fermentation. The distiller would barrel those separately. That's usually called a flavoring whiskey. So it's
Mm-hmm.
still got a lot of those rich, interesting flavors. But then they might run it through a separate batch through the distilling process again to allow the alcohol to be refined more, and it lets you clarify some more complex flavors.
Mm-hmm.
And then that will be barreled separately as well. The last thing I just want to touch on is the barreling. The barrels themselves also impart a lot of flavor to the whiskey.
Oh, yeah.
Wood, of course, is very porous. And the barrels are stored in an unclimate controlled environment because it takes advantage of the fact that when the wood expands, it draws an amount of whiskey into the wood, into the porousness of the wood. And then when it contracts, again in the cold, it releases it back into the mix. So as it's absorbed into the wood, it's taking on a lot of the natural sugars in the wood. Barrels can be new, they can be charred. And when the barrel is charred, essentially using a torch, it starts to caramelize those sugars in the wood. And so that can kind of help the maturing process as well. Sometimes a distiller might barrel in a used barrel. So maybe a barrel the first time was used to age bourbon. It's been sold and now used to age a Canadian rye. So it's imparting some of those flavors of the bourbon as well.
Oh, so they'll mix that up. They won't stick with one barrel is strictly just for whiskey and one is specifically for bourbon. They'll reuse each barrel on each one.
Yeah, it depends on the distiller. It depends on the type of whiskey, but yeah, these barrels are still kind of in circulation. So yeah, those are the different things that are imparting a lot of flavor to the whiskey.
Can you describe the differences between the big taste categories in whiskey?
For sure. So three of the really big categories, I suppose, you'd have bourbon, Canadian whiskeys, and Scotch. And those kind of reflect a big difference in the type of grain that's being used, the fermentation process, and the distilling process. Bourbon tends to be really complex, intense. It's a young alcohol. It's only aged usually about 3 years. And so it has a lot of really interesting, complex flavors, but really, really intense because of that young alcohol. Canadian rye whiskeys can be a little more mellow and full-bodied. They tend not to have like a really focused flavor profile. Instead, it's a much more broad combination of a lot of different flavors.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got Scotch, which there's a lot of different regions. And so Scotch, while it's kind of a category in its own, separate from Canadian whiskey,
Mm-hmm.
it's a really big umbrella. But typically, you tend to have flavors that are a little bit smokier because of the use of peat in their drying process.
Mm-hmm.
They're a bit more thin, maybe more refined, and they have more pronounced flavor profiles.
Okay, this one's for me though. So when you say, if someone says they're ordering a rye and Coke or rye and ginger, a rye is a whiskey. So when you say whiskey, it's encompassing all of them, correct?
Yeah. So, I mean, we kind of shorten the name, but bourbon is bourbon whiskey, rye is rye whiskey, Scotch is Scotch whiskey. And it all just depends on what it's made with, how it's made, and how it's aged and stored.
Oh, okay. So what makes up the flavor profile of whiskey?
Right. So these sorts of things are coming from the byproducts of fermentation with the yeast, because when you're distilling whiskey, you're not putting cinnamon or pear peels or citrus or any of that. You're not putting any of that in during the distilling process. So when we refer to stuff like that, you'll find flavors that remind you of something, and it's just this sort of terminology that kind of helps you to describe it. So kind of the main categories that you might find are spices like cinnamon, pepper. You might find fruits like pear, apple, cherry, or fruits more like citrus. From there, you could maybe find some floral flavors, something like rosemary or coriander or elderflower. You'll also have sugars, things like brown sugar, molasses, licorice, maybe. I tried very recently really unique whiskey from Banff, BC. And it's one of these craft distilleries, and what they've done is they did a rye whiskey, but they didn't age it at all. They bottled it right after the distillation process.
Mm-hmm.
And so what that means is technically it's not even whiskey; it's a unaged grain spirit. And it had this really interesting, powerful, focused flavor because, of course, it's not taking on flavors from the barrel, from being mixed with other more flavorful whiskey. So it had this really intense red licorice flavor. And
Mm-hmm.
it took me a really long time to put my finger on it. There was something so familiar about the flavor. So yeah, those kind of sugars are definitely pronounced. Wood flavors that, of course, are going to be mostly imparted by the barreling. So you might have oak, walnut, maybe pecan flavors. And then there's just some other things that you might find in there. Vanilla is a commonly described flavor in Scotch.
Mm-hmm.
You might find ginger, peat, that smokiness that we talk about. So yeah, there's a lot of different interesting flavors that you find. And when you're tasting that, what you're really tasting is the byproduct of fermentation, or maybe the barrels and things like that. But there's no actual additives during the distillation process that would make you taste blackberry, for example.
What can people do to develop their palates?
So I'm not a sommelier. This is just kind of a hobby of mine. But what I found really helpful is for people to find a baseline. My favorite whiskey, and one that I've been drinking for years, it's called 40 Creek. It's distilled from barley and corn, distilled in two separate batches. One is aged in new American white oak, and one is aged in ex-bourbon barrels. They're aged for around 6 years, and then they're blended on bottling. And so knowing all that and kind of, like I mentioned, it's my baseline. And so I've got a really good idea of the different flavors in that. But then when I branch out, I can kind of compare the flavors that are likely to have come from differences in the mash, right? So if my favorite whiskey is distilled from barley and corn, and I try something else that's distilled from rye, you can kind of tell like those certain differences are tied to one of those things, right? So it's the corn mash, it's the aging, it's the barreling. Those major differences kind of inform what you're tasting.
Okay.
hmm The other thing is that 40 Creek happened to be established in 1992, which is when I was born. So
Oh, that's so nice.
kind of a funny coincidence, but
It really is, actually. And that's what you use as your baseline.
so yeah, having
Planned
that
that way, or
baseline,
it just happened?
maybe meant to be.
What role does smell play in developing the palate?
Smell is interesting. It plays a pretty big role. There's certain things that you might be able to detect smell wise that are maybe a little bit tougher to uncover flavor wise. The tricky thing with whiskey though is it is quite powerful. I mean, it's whiskey is typically 40%, some stronger, and so that first whiff, people will often just think, oh, that's like jet fuel. No, I can't. I can't. It's because you're getting that strong whiff of alcohol, and it can be tough to get past. What a lot of people recommend is to just kind of take a quick nosing first, to try and absorb that and kind of get past it a little bit, and then kind of longer and longer and longer after that, as you're sort of pushing past that alcohol and trying to find those more subtle aromas.
Now, Frank calls me bloodhound because I smell everything. I can smell something from a mile away. And the thing with whiskeys is when I go to take a sip of it, it's that first scent of that strong whiskey.
Interesting you mentioned tasting whiskey with your sense of smell.
Mm-hmm.
Something I have noticed, I'm not sure if this is, a phenomenon recognized in professional tasting or anything like that, but
Mm,
I have noticed something that can be really off-putting when you're drinking whiskey. People tend to take a little breath in just before they have a drink of anything, whether coffee, water, whatever.
exactly.
Uh, when you do that with whiskey, it really, because your nose is right in that tumbler, and you're going to get a powerful kick of that alcohol. Like I was mentioning earlier, you want to take that
Yeah.
sort of like small whiff first. But if you're kind of doing that thing that you would drink, say water normally, that little breath in, you're going to get really kicked in the nose with that
Oh,
powerful
yeah.
alcohol, and it's kind of going to affect your experience. It's going to kind of, you're going to be focused on that rather than the taste and the complexness of the drink.
Oh, well, I mean, I got this Italian nose. It's right in my tumbler. But so I'm inhaling all of it. So for me, I guess the best thing to do is try not to take that big gulp of air beforehand.
That's right. Yeah.
What if you wanted to kind of taste a few of them in one sitting? Is there something that you would recommend or use as a subtle kind of palate cleanser? I mean, we have it in between meals with food, but is there something you can do for whiskeys when you're tasting a few of them?
Absolutely. So tasting a few whiskeys at a time is an awesome way to sort of develop your palate. Um, you get to pick out those differences immediately rather than, if week to week or month to month, opening a different bottle sort of thing. But when you're nosing the whiskey, actually smelling your own skin kind of resets your nose because it's sort of a neutral smell that you're used to.
Really?
And yeah, it resets your nose. It's a really interesting phenomenon. And that can help you to kind of push past that strong alcohol smell, just kind of reset every so often. In tasting, there's these sort of like, I guess they're specialty crackers, like palate cleansing crackers. They're really bland, they have no taste, and they kind of absorb, excess alcohol and saliva in your mouth. They're very dry. But I find arrowroot crackers have a really similar effect.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. And of course, those are available anywhere. So.
Exactly. Something that you mentioned to me that I think our listeners would love is there's a cool tip you mentioned about bringing out the other flavors, doing something to your tumbler of whiskey that brings out some hidden flavors in your glass.
Yeah, so there's a couple interesting things that you can do. One thing that happens with whiskey, because there's a lot of different, as I mentioned, byproducts that make up the flavor profile, and there's a lot of different densities going on in there. And so what tends to happen sometimes is when, especially after bottling, when a bottle is sat for a long time, um, those kind of molecules of the other byproducts, they can kind of settle down to the bottom, and alcohol, it's less dense, so that's kind of sits on top. So what people do sometimes is you just put like 2 or 3 drops of like distilled water. You would call it 2 drops to bloom is kind of the phrase. And what it does is it just dropping that water in there just kind of stirs everything up, and it moves those flavor molecules around. And it brings out the complexity of the drink a little bit more.
I'm a beginner starting out. Should I start with ice in my glass or no ice? So on the rocks or straight?
You know what? Some purists will tell you that you never drink an ice scotch with ice.
Mm-hmm.
And while I agree with that, honestly, there's no wrong way to drink your whiskey. So if you enjoy it better over ice,
Mm-hmm.
go for it. If it kind of dilutes it down a little bit, I would say if you're going to do that, look for spherical ice molds. Use one big chunk of ice. The sphere molds work really well, I find, because
Oh,
what
I've
it does
seen them. Yes.
is it cools your whiskey, maybe dilutes it down a little bit, but when it's one large chunk of ice, it tends to melt much less quickly. So then you don't end up with a beautiful 18-year-old Scotch that has been watered down times 3. But that's an interesting point, is that temperature has a big effect on whiskey. So water will stir up those flavor molecules a little bit, but temperature will affect them. So ice is one thing, but you can also use a mulling stone. Usually it's like a soapstone rock. And what you do is you can either put it in the oven, or you can pour boiling water over it, and then you move the hot stone and you put it in your tumbler. And the temperature really brings out some different and interesting parts of the whiskey that maybe are not present at room temperature.
That's interesting because I've always thought of, chilling something, never the reverse. to heat it up to bring out other flavors.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So whenever I'm trying a new bottle of something, I'll always try it with a little bit of water. Another time I'll try it over ice, and another time I'll try it with a mulling stone. And it kind of gives you the breadth of the experience.
So if they don't have a mulling stone, can someone just heat up their glass slightly?
Sure, yeah, maybe you could do that. If the glass is warm with hot water, it maybe won't warm your whiskey to the point of a mulling stone, but it definitely have a similar, if not slightly more subtle effect.
Right. So it's a little warmer than room temperature, but okay, now what about pairings?
People tend to pair whiskeys with red meats. I mean, you kind of get the Ron Swanson sort of idea. You have your Scotch with your 32-ounce porterhouse steak and your potatoes and, meat and potatoes and Scotch. Sort of people's go-to kind of thing. But they can go really great with appetizers before dinner. Most distillers have their own tasting notes. So if you kind of match those with something that you're serving before dinner, you can really kind of match some interesting flavors. A couple weeks back on the show, we had Jeff Faber, who's a chef and was working out in the Niagara region. And he was telling us about an appetizer that he did there with seasonal golden beets and goat cheese.
Mm-hmm.
That could pair really nicely with sort of a Speyside region Scotch, which they tend to have really pronounced honey flavors. So there's certain things like that you can kind of pair up.
Okay, I can do that.
Yeah.
I can definitely do that. Now I'm curious. With whiskey, is it something that people tend to drink? Is it more an after-dinner drink? Is it more a pre-dinner drink? Is it something where you just sit and, like you mentioned, just appetizers or finger foods or something? Or is it just a drink that you can have anytime?
To be honest, I feel personally it's a drink to be had anytime, provided it's after 4 o'clock.
Somewhere
After that. But interesting that you mentioned like dessert. One of my favorite pairings, actually, a really dark, complex bourbon like Woodford Reserve, and a bowl of French vanilla ice cream.
Oh, you pour it on top?
I do not pour it on top, but I consume both.
At the same
together.
Time. Okay, so you could technically pour it on top.
You could,
if you wanted to.
Not my preferred delivery method, but sure. You could just get right in there and pour it over like maple syrup. Yeah.
Oh, that sounds good. Okay, I can do that as well.
It's excellent. They complement each other quite nicely, I have to say. But yeah, there's great pairings for whether it's like your main meal, appetizers, dessert afterwards, whatever. It's there's lots of great pairings out there.
Honestly, after talking about whiskey, all this and you describing it and the flavors, I actually want to try it. Like I seriously want to try it now.
Yeah.
I've tried it once, but hearing you describe it and explain it in a way where someone like me who's never even thought about whiskey in that way, in that sense, wants to actually try it now.
Yeah.
With a different view on it.
Well, I think my favorite thing about this whole learning process of tasting whiskey has been the fact that I started out really skeptical and I guess mocking of those tasting notes that you hear. They sound so ridiculous, and you're thinking, okay, if you're putting grain into a pot and distilling alcohol from it, how could you possibly be tasting vanilla or pineapple or whatever else the heck you're saying? But then the more reading that you do and the more learning that you do, you find out why these flavors are imparted, and it's very interesting to learn about the chemistry and the fact that these flavors do exist, and there is a reason that they're in there as a part of this whole big stew in the mix.
I think we're all guilty of that. I do it all the time. I talk about these notes and how can someone, decipher between a floral and a vanilla and this and that. But I think it's because we do it more to camouflage the fact that we know nothing about it. But when you start, like you said, learning about it, like we did here, and you're telling me and you're teaching me about all these different processes and what actually brings out those tastes, those flavors, it makes me look at it very differently.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so I think Frank and I are going to be sitting there with whiskeys in front of us.
That's amazing.
If you don't hear from me later, you'll know I've passed out.
An afternoon well spent.
Can you leave us with a recipe of your favorite pairing or a recipe for something that we can maybe even cook with? Who knows?
Yeah, so I have been experimenting in the kitchen a little bit, and often when I cook, I do enjoy to have a little bit of whiskey off to the side there for personal consumption.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes that makes its way into the cooking a little bit, and I came across a really cool recipe a while back. So it's a pork tenderloin with a bourbon brown butter sauce.
That sounds
It's
good.
it's very good. So all you do is so you rub down the tenderloin with olive oil, salt, and pepper. You're going to sear it in a cast iron pan on all sides, um, and then you're going to move it to the oven at 300 until it's at an internal temperature of 150 degrees Fahrenheit. So you're just going to kind of slow cook that, and then you're going to move the pan back onto the stovetop and pop it on medium to low heat. Move the tenderloin to a board and cover it in tin foil to let it rest. While it's resting, deglaze the pan because you've got lots of great flavors going on in there from
That's always the best flavor.
yeah. So you're going to deglaze that with 2 ounces of bourbon, add a quarter cup of butter and a clove of minced garlic. And then you're going to let that cook for about 5 to 8 minutes. You got to stir it constantly to keep the butter from burning, but you want the butter to sort of bubble a little bit and start to turn kind of a light to medium brown. Um, and then just add a little bit of fresh thyme and ground coriander to taste, and drizzle that over your sliced pork tenderloin.
Oh my gosh, that sounds good.
It's really fantastic.
I would probably do like a little side of corn, maybe some rice, something.
That would pair very nicely.
And thank you, now I'm hungry. How about gift giving?
Yeah, you know what? Even if whiskey's not for you, even if after all this you go and you do a whiskey tasting and still feel it tastes a lot like gasoline, I guarantee you know somebody that is super into whiskey. We're kind of coming up to the holiday season soon-ish. So I thought I'd share a couple ideas with you guys, gifts for the whiskey lover in your life or for yourself. 3 books to check out. Number one is called Whiskey, What to Drink Next, and that's by Dominic Roscoe. This book is really interesting. It kind of takes you through all the different categories of whiskey because there's just so many. It even touches on some of those craft distillery ones that I was telling you about that experiment with, quinoa and oak whiskeys or oat whiskeys rather. All the different regions of Scotland, and it gives you a little bit of history. It gives you 3 different types to try from that category, and it kind of rates things from kind of least expensive and widely available to pretty rare. So it's great for a range of people, and it's got a really interesting diagram that helps you on your way to sort of comparing tasting notes. Another one, which is the source of a lot of my knowledge on this, is a book called Canadian Whiskey, second edition. It's by Davin de Kergomeu, and it's got a lot of the history of Canadian distilleries about prohibition, but it's got a lot of really interesting information on the process itself. That's an excellent one as well. And finally, Jim Murray, a guy named Jim Murray, he is one of the biggest names in whiskey, and he releases Jim Murray's Whiskey Bible. There's a new edition every year. Lots of great information, and he always does his top rated whiskeys of the year.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of really interesting stuff in there. And that actually leads me to, you want to gift a bottle of whiskey. There's a lot of really interesting options out there for really reasonable prices.
That'd be great because I know a lot of people that are whiskey drinkers and would love something gifted to them.
Okay, well, you're going to love this. So, Jim Murray in 2017 named Crown Royal Harvest Rye, distilled in Winnipeg, the top Canadian whiskey of the year. It costs $35 at the LCBO.
Okay.
It's an amazing whiskey, really great starter if you're looking to buy for someone who's just getting into tasting,
Mm-hmm.
or is a seasoned veteran. I'll also plug my favorite whiskey, 40 Creek Barrel Select, $30. That's distilled in Grimsby, Ontario, and is a great whiskey for baselines. That's my baseline whiskey. Then there's the Canadian Club Classic 12 year. Canadian Club is kind of a brand that has a bit of a bad rep for just, being that jet fuel, suitable only to cut with ginger ale sort of thing. But
Okay, I've heard that. I have definitely heard that.
in recent years, there's been some big changes with the distillery, and they're putting out some really great stuff. The Classic 12 year is a really smooth whiskey. It's full bodied, got lots of really interesting flavors, and that's $30. So those are some great options if you're looking to buy for someone, or if you're looking to get started. They're very different whiskeys, so if you're looking at getting into tasting, that's a good place to start as well.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me on.
You have now changed my opinion and my outlook on whiskey. You've made me actually want to turn around, go this afternoon, get a couple of bottles, and taste test with Frank.
And push through that jet fuel.
It's that time. We've reached the end of another show. Be sure to visit kitchenconfession.com for more recipes and foodie finds. I'd like to thank producer and editor Matt Agnew, and I'm Mary Mamaliti. See you at the next episode.